Developed by Ubisoft Bordeaux, the Assassin's Creed series celebrates its 15th anniversary this year with Assassin's Creed Mirage. Originally meant as an expansion to 2020's Assassin's Creed Valhalla, the overall scale of Mirage is certainly dialed down this time around. Expect a shorter, narratively tighter adventure, which is no bad thing. Not every game has to be an epic. Instead, Mirage focuses on a single main character too this year, named Basim, a new recruit to the Assassin's Brotherhood who unleashes his parkour skills on a beautiful realization of 9th century Baghdad. From the arid city outskirts to the bustle of the Damascus gates, all of this is brought to life by the Ubisoft Anvil engine. But given so much of Mirage's technical DNA is shared with Valhalla, to what extent does the game's visual setup, the resolutions on PlayStation 5, Xbox Series X and S carry over? Is there anything to split Series X and S in particular in comparison? And lastly, do we get a locked 60 FPS this time around on each? Let's find out. Despite its connections to Valhalla's tech, there's no question Mirage is a smaller project overall. Just looking at the install sizes on Series X says a lot in fact. It's a 33GB install compared to 110GB for Valhalla right now. As scaled back as it is though, the Baghdad area of Mirage is still beautifully designed by Ubisoft's artists. Every district of the city is crammed with detail, between the wells of the dyeing factory right up to the stables ahead of the prince's palace. The use of volumetric lighting is on point too. At dusk, flare-ups of dust are caught by streaks of light, adding a strong sense of depth. The only blemish really is that, well, character detail doesn't hold up. Most NPCs, for example, on the streets, have cloth physics attached to them, but the processing of these physics only engages at a certain range, which causes this awkward, visible snap as NPCs pass a threshold up ahead. Even major characters up close have issues with the uncanny valley effect. Something about the animation of the eyes here doesn't look quite right. So again, the world design of Mirage is superb, but the character models filling it out still don't quite hit the same standard. This applies to every console of course, from PS5 to Series X to S, which leads us to the comparisons. The first bit of good news is that all three consoles launched with the same options. There are two modes, as with Valhalla, a 60 frames per second frame rate mode and a higher resolution quality mode at 30 FPS. And yes, this includes Series S from day one. As ever with Assassin's Creed though, beware that there is a randomized element to time of day, cloud coverage, and of course NPC distribution. It might cause a slight variance in side-by-sides. Still, sampling the start of the game with a perfect sync in weather, PS5, Series X and S are broadly identical in their quality modes. You get a dynamic 4K on PS5 and Series X, going down at occasional points to 1944p, which is the lowest value on record, but even lower might be possible. And on Series S, we get a still impressive dynamic 1620p with 1512p as the lower bounds there. In terms of visual differences otherwise, PS5 and Series X use precisely the same settings in textures, draw distance, shadow quality and beyond. It's only in comparing Series S to Series X that we see any real differences on the 30 FPS quality mode. Focusing on the two Xboxes here then, the margins are slight but worth pointing out. Firstly, during big panorama shots of the city, Series S reins in its level of detail setting for geometry and also tree quality. It doesn't really show up on the street level, but zooming in from high points, note the missing tent structures on the building tops. And equally that Series S uses lower grade tree models. Switching between the two shows it off best, but the reality is, in general runs across the city, it barely notices. Another point to mention is the shadow quality, which gets a boost on Series X here, though we get an even bigger divide if we switch over to each console's respective 60 FPS frame rate mode, where Series S drops to an even lower setting. Beyond this, the two machines, even with the 4 teraflop versus 12 teraflop divide in spec, run at very close settings in any run through the city streets. Neither machine misses out. Speaking of the 60fps frame rate mode, let's switch over to that now. PS5 and Series X each double their output frames, with the main drawback being, of course, the resolution. That means a drop to 1800p dynamic on each, with 1440p as their lower bounds. A similar setup to Valhalla before it then, though with a slightly higher maximum reading. As for Series S, it's a dynamic 1080p in this case, with 864p as the lower bounds. Honestly, this is a much more noticeable drop in image quality. Distant detail is less defined, but it's a fair trade to get the same game running at 60fps. Now, resolution isn't the only setting that gets dropped to hit 60fps here. Taking Series X as an example and comparing frame rate versus quality modes, there's a few other tweaks. Notably, again, we see geometry and plant LEDs dropped on the performance mode using this same panorama shot. Expect more pop-in at range as we approach those rooftop structures. They still appear eventually, but only render at a more proximate range to the player. Otherwise though, on Series X and PS5, both modes turn in a very similar experience on the streets. Texture quality, the volumetric fog, even the NPC count appears to stay in place regardless of mode. Switching over to performance testing, Mirage expectedly has a similar profile to series entries before it. So there's good news if you want to stick to the 30fps quality mode here. Based on the first 3 to 4 hours of play, this is a watertight 30 on every current gen machine, PS5, Series X, and even Series S. The reading doesn't even suffer a single frame blip during any parkour action, at least so far. No hitching either. The complex inner city area stream in fluidly, whether it's on horseback or flying overhead from an eagle-eye view. Tellingly, even moving the camera rapidly up and then down doesn't incur any brief frame rate drops. The game's frame rate doesn't buckle, in other words, as the renderer tries to adjust the resolution based on a sudden spike in GPU load, which is an issue with the frame rate mode at 60, as we'll get to. Simply put, when set to the quality mode, Mirage stays at a flat 30fps regardless of what you do. Next up is the 60fps frame rate mode. The situation at 60fps isn't quite as polished, I will say, not quite as firmly locked at that target. Effectively, it is there 99% of the time, but there are ways to stress the engine to find that remaining 1%. The gist is, making any rapid camera motion from the sky back down to the city incurs a sharp rise in GPU load. And within that moment the GPU load rises, screen tearing flares up at the top of the display, and at worst you'll see a single frame drop. Likewise for rapid camera pans from the outskirts to the city centre, it's the game's DRS system trying to play catch-up by dropping the native resolution as quickly as possible once it recognises any GPU spike. Both PS5 and Series X alike have issues in this regard, though anecdotally I will say, I've noticed tearing appears more frequently on Series X. Fortunately, the rule of thumb for the frame rate mode is that it still holds up well on both. You get a fixed 60fps in almost every scenario, and really these moments are the outliers to the general experience. Jumping over to Series S, again Ubisoft Bordeaux have optimised well for the 4 teraflop profile of the system. The drop to a dynamic 1080p is well justified here, I think. It runs at 60fps with similar occasional flashes of screen tearing to Series X. It's hard to complain about the turnout though, it's again extremely playable at 60. The one major point to be aware of, the biggest downgrade for Series S, is that the in-engine cutscenes switch to a 30fps cap. Unlike PS5 and Series X, which just plow on through at 60 regardless, there is a forced half refresh here. But as far as actual gameplay is concerned, nothing is lost on Series S. The Ubisoft Anvil engine has zero issues scaling to Series S, and that bears out in the frame rate even in complex city areas on horseback. As a way to celebrate the Assassin's Creed series legacy, Mirage doesn't disappoint on the latest crop of consoles. Many of the issues we saw with Valhalla, the early troubles with frame rate stability in 2020, appeared to have been solved at launch this time. PS5, Series X and S owners all enjoy 30 and 60fps modes from day one. Each one hits the mark as you'd hope to, where only the odd burst of tearing at 60fps holds them back from perfection. Sticking to 60fps is my recommendation though, especially given the sacrifices aren't too dear for the premium consoles, with a drop to a dynamic 1800p plus marginal LOD differences. As for Series S, the hit to a dynamic 1080p is obviously more pronounced in order to make 60fps work, though at least 60fps makes the cut for launch this time there. Again, Ubisoft's engine optimization on Series S appears to benefit from all the continued work that went into Valhalla post-release, the payoff being a well-rounded turnout for Mirage at launch on current-gen consoles. Just a quick look at the console situation for Assassin's Creed Mirage today, but if you did enjoy this video, feel free to like or subscribe, and don't forget to hit that bell for instant notifications as any new video lands. To get a high quality version of this video, check out our Patreon at digitalfoundry.net, and to get in touch directly, you know where to find me. But from me for now, thanks for watching.